With NXT TakeOver Wargames 2019 now come and gone, I have to say that I absolutely love this event, especially the two matches that the show is named after. In fact, I would go as far as saying that these two were the best NXT Wargames matches that the company ever saw. And the reason why I would say that is because these bouts achieve certain objectives that I think Wargames matches are always supposed to accomplish. What objectives are those? Well, they're the topic of this episode. Because today, Dave knows the purpose of Wargames. When it comes to wrestling matches and match types, there are a lot of wrestling fans that will tell you that each has a specific purpose, a reason why you book one over any other, and Wargames is definitely no exception. Now, to be clear, this is my own personal opinion on what the best use of Wargames is, and while there are many fans who will agree with me, I feel the need to point out that this is just my own personal view on the matter. However, with that being said, there is a lot to support my thoughts on what makes Wargames the best it can possibly be, and to explore that, we'll be taking a look at some history, getting some behind the scenes details, and talking about what made this year just so great. And speaking of which, we might as well start at the beginning. Now, I've previously talked about Wargames before in prior episodes, like the ones I did about the Great American Bash and Fall Brawl, but a little refresher on the origins of a match never hurt anyone. Wargames was the invention of the American Dream himself, Dusty Rhodes. After seeing the film Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, Dusty was inspired to create a brand new gimmick bout, and so he came up with Wargames, the Match Beyond, which was the original name of the bout. And I also can't help but notice that its name took inspiration from not just one, but two classic 80s films. Anyway, the first Wargames match happened at the NWA's Great American Bash 1987 and was held at the Omni in Atlanta, Georgia. By the way, back then the Bash was more of a tour rather than just a single pay-per-view. Now, the rules to Wargames were simple. The match would begin with one member from each team squaring off in the cage for 5 minutes. Then another wrestler would enter, followed by yet another every 2 minutes after that, until all members from both teams are in the cage. And speaking of this entering every 2 minutes concept, might I point out that Wargames predates the Royal Rumble, and as far as the team thing goes, it also came out before Survivor Series. But back to the lecture at hand. Once all members have entered the cage, this officially begins the Match Beyond. Because up until this point, no one can actually win the match. It's only after everyone has entered can a fall happen. But how exactly do you score a victory? Well, the original format was a bit different than what NXT does today, as the match originally could only be won by submission, knockout, or surrender, but not by pinfall, as that wasn't added on till after WCW officially took the match over from the NWA. Now, this was all done to really sell the idea that this was an epic battle between warring teams and less of a traditional wrestling contest. And that brings us to the first major purpose behind the Wargames match, and that's intense hatred. Wargames works best when you're pitting two teams against each other who have a serious axe to grind. Just sticking random guys in two rings with a cage wrapped around it would just water down the whole experience. But when you sell the bout as being the only way to resolve the nth level conflict between raging groups of wrestlers, then that really works to set the stage right. And this is something that I think NXT has always managed to do really well. Just remember the announcement for the first NXT Wargames match. After Sanity, the Authors of Pain, and the Undisputed Era, along with Roderick Strong, kept getting into massive brawls with each other, it was William Regal who declared that the only way to restore order in NXT was to settle things with Wargames. Which was an awesome moment and a really great way to bring the bout back, even though I would have preferred 2 teams as opposed to 3, but what are you gonna do? Now, speaking of the Undisputed Era, obviously the match wasn't originally conceived with that team in mind, but there was another heel faction which was a big factor in the creation of the match. The Horsemen, as Wargames was originally meant to serve as a specialty bout specifically for them, and this accomplishes multiple objectives by having the Horsemen as the focal point. For starters, in the summer of 1987, the Horsemen's team captain Ric Flair was in the middle of one of his many NWA World Championship reigns. Really no surprise there. But with the Great American Bash, one of the biggest wrestling events of the year, how could booking keep the title on Flair, but yet still deliver a satisfying match for the fans? I mean, you could have Flair lose the title, but then then Dusty finish it, although you definitely can't go to that well too many times. And that could also leave the fans feeling deflated, which is a common problem with booking a long title reign for a heel champion. And with this particular NWA World title reign of Flair's lasting over a year from August of 1986 to September of 1987, this was definitely a long title reign. So what do we do here? How do we keep the belt on Flair but still allow the babyfaces to get a meaningful win? Well, enter Wargames. This match, if built up correctly, will feel like an awesome victory for the winners, even though nothing is actually on the line here. This way, the good guys get a win, any and all belts will stay put, and the fans will get to go home happy. From here, this simple yet effective formula would repeat, as additional Wargames matches would be held in Miami and Chicago throughout the rest of the summer, with various babyfaces, particularly Dusty Rhodes, taking down the Horsemen and giving them their comeuppance. But it didn't stop there. For the most part, a similar mindset when it came to booking was used for the next couple of years, even going on after the Great American Bash, 1989. The faces would win and the heels would lose. That is, until February of 1991 and the event called Wrestle War. This saw Horsemen Ric Flair, Barry Windham, and Sid Vicious, along with Larry Zbyszko, who was substituting for Arn Anderson, who was out with an injury at the time, finally getting a Wargames victory against the babyface team of Sting, Brian Pillman, and the Steiner brothers. Now, this match ended when Pillman, who was taking repeated powerbombs from Sid, had El Gigante run down to surrender on Pillman's behalf. However, since the heels won, did this go against the very purpose of Wargames? Well, not exactly. While I do prefer babyfaces walking out of Wargames with the win, there can be exceptions to this rule. Because for me, a principle that I think gets lost on some is that wrestling is about getting things over. And with this ending, while Flair was yet again in the middle of a world title run, there were a few things that went right by having the Horsemen win this match. First, allow me to point out that this exact reign of Flair's really wasn't all that long, since it was only originally recognized as being from January of 1991 to May of 1991. But it's even shorter still when you consider that Flair really lost the title in March to Tatsumi Fujinami. Now, this win was originally not acknowledged by the National Wrestling Alliance, but WWE has since started counting it, and so has the NWA, which is a complicated issue that I could do another video on, and I already have, like, a long time ago. Anyway, the other important factor here is that this was all done at a volatile time for both promotions. And I do mean both, because this Wargames match was not done under the NWA banner, but instead, Wrestle War was a WCW event. You see, this was in the early stages of WCW really coming into the forefront as the next big company, and this time period was also part of the NWA shifting out of the top tier. And so, this transition was a great time to reestablish a few things. WCW wisely decided to bring Wargames back, seeing that it hadn't been done in over a year at this point. And while they're at it, why not also use this to keep Flair looking strong as a champion during this transitional period? And by allowing the Horsemen to gain a solid win, you double down on an already established act, solidifying your biggest draw that you inherited as your company levels up to a higher tier. Meanwhile, you still manage to keep your babyfaces protected to a degree by having a non-team member surrender for you. This keeps Sting, the top babyface, from having to take the loss himself, and it also made Pillman a more sympathetic character by having him taking a beating but still not submitting. In the end, several parties ended up looking better than they did when they went into the event, and WCW wound up looking great too by delivering on an awesome match. But don't worry, because the Horsemen definitely wouldn't be making a habit out of this, as Wargames would mostly be won by babyface teams for the remainder of WCW, usually with Sting on the winning side. However, there would be a Wargames match that ended with the Horsemen taking the L, but a heel faction still winning. Enter 1997, with the Horsemen losing to the New World Order. And to be fair, the NWO also won in 1996 too, defeating Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, and Lex Luger after Sting walked out on his team. But even though all these wrestlers were Horsemen at one point, they weren't officially Horsemen at this time. Just wanted to bring that up real quick. Anyway, moving on, during the 1997 match, Wargames was now a regular occurrence during WCW's Fall Brawl pay-per-view. And as far as I was concerned, it was this match that gave us the official passing of the torch between the old baddest stable on the block to the new toughest team in wrestling. And the finish to this match came when Mongo surrendered for the team after Kurt Hennig turned on the Horsemen to reveal that he was really a part of the NWO the entire time. Now again, this was a great way to get the right talent over. The NWO needed to be dominant, and what better way to do so than to have them scheme a win over the old guard. And the way I see it, this was the last true Wargames match, at least until this year. Because following 1997, we would see 3 teams of 3, which I didn't like when WCW did it, nor did I like it when NXT did it either. And then there would be no Wargames match in 1999. Following this in 2000, we were saddled with that Vince Russo Ready to Rumble Triple Cage nonsense, which is definitely not a Wargames match. And after this, WCW folded, causing Wargames to take a hiatus until NXT finally brought it back in 2017. And since doing so, while I have enjoyed aspects and was just glad to see it come back in any capacity, it wasn't until this year that I felt that NXT really got things right. Now for starters, yes, I am one of those sticklers for not being happy about the lack of roof, and I know they do it so that way the wrestlers can jump off of it. However, as cool as that is, I do miss the confined and in-prison feel that you only get if the cage has a ceiling. But putting that aside, as I recall, the one major thing that came out of that match was how everybody was impressed with Killian Dane. And hey, good for him, and he definitely deserved that, but Wargames is meant to get multiple wrestlers over and not just one. And while the Undisputed Era did win, I don't think they were any more over afterwards than they were when the match began. Plus, even if they did, remember it was only a team of 3 that year. Then in 2018, at least they were back to a 2-team format, and the babyfaces did win that one. However, there was one major component missing. Which brings us to this year, and not just 1, but 2 truly great Wargames matches that featured the heel champions of Adam Cole and Shayna Baszler losing to their babyface opponents, thus keeping the belts where they were, but finally allowing the good guys to get some real retribution. Tommaso Ciampa came out looking good, as well as a returning Kevin Owens, and so did Candice LeRae, and of course, the big star of the weekend, Rhea Ripley, who won the match with a handcuff spot, which was teased earlier in the match, and then delivered on in the end to give an awesome finish to the bout. Imagine that, they set something up and then paid it off later? What a concept! And on top of all that, the heels like Io Shirai, Bianca Belair, and the turn of Dakota Kai on Tegan Nox made the storytelling of this match really compelling. There were a ton of elements going on in both bouts this year with a lot of great talent, and it all worked together to make Wargames everything that makes it just so special. Well, there you go, my thoughts on what makes Wargames so great. But what do you think? Let me know down in the comments what makes Wargames such a great treat to watch. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe right here to Dave Knows Wrestling. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, Dave knows.